You ready?
Are we live? No.
No. You're live.
Hello, my name is Elizabeth Bice. I'm the Federal Treasurer of Socialist Action, a member of the NDP Socialist Caucus Steering Committee. We acknowledge that we are hosting this event on Indigenous lands across Turtle Island, known as North America. That includes the unceded territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Wendat and Haudenosaunee people, in the place called Toronto. Today, I'm speaking to you from Jamaica, where the indigenous Taino and Arawak-speaking people began arriving here 4,000 years ago, but were wiped out by European colonial powers. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Tonight's webcast title is Basic Income Dissolution with John Clarke, Karen Hana, and Gary Porter. John will speak for about 25 minutes. Karen and Gary will speak up to 10 minutes each. Then we will take questions from the online audience. Audience members can submit a question by accessing the website directly from YouTube and by typing the question directly onto the chat column. You can direct your question to one of the panelists or just to everybody. If you like this webcast, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. If you agree with what you hear here tonight, please join Socialist Action by signing up at our website, www.socialistaction.ca, or give us a call, 647-986-1917. That's 647-986-1917. So let's begin. John Clarke was born in England. He moved with his family to London, Ontario in the 1970s. When John moved to Toronto, he became one of the founding members of the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. In 2019, John retired as provincial organizer of OCAP, but then took on the post of Packer Visitor in Socialist Justice in the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies in York University. Welcome, John.
Thanks very, very much. Okay, so let me try to set out some of the essential considerations, I think, around what I think I would describe as a left opposition to the concept of basic income. I want to first of all acknowledge a couple of things, and that is that many of the sentiments that are fueling support for basic income on the left and widely amongst ordinary working class people are very understandable and express very good ideas and very good sentiments. The notion that the understanding and the realization that we are living in a period that has seen decades of austerity, decades of worsening attacks on people's living standards and rights, and that we are now at a period of absolutely unprecedented hardship and uncertainty. And so the concept that people want something better and want, as part of that, an income that is secure and adequate is entirely appropriate and entirely correct. And I'm also going to acknowledge something else, and that is that I think the case for basic income has appealed to people. And it may well be that tonight, and there's been other forums that I've spoken on this subject, I found myself to be in a minority. And that may be the case tonight, and I accept that. But I want to put forward what I consider to be the reasons why it is a mistake, and a serious mistake, for the political left to buy into the concept of basic income. We know that there are considerable numbers of corporate mouthpieces who support the concept of basic income. There is in Ontario at the moment a group calling itself UBI Works that advocates for basic income, and it's made up of many of the people who opposed increasing the minimum wage. It's known that the supporters of the basic income include the Silicon Valley billionaires, at one time Milton Friedman, and it's sort of, these are the kind of people who would not support increases in the minimum wage or advances in income support. These are people who would not support an extension of workers' rights or union rights. And yet there's considerable support on the political right and amongst the sort of the institutions of neoliberal global capitalism for the idea of basic income. And so to sort of begin to discuss the question of basic income, before we do, I think it's necessary to step back and look at what function and what the limits have been placed on systems of income support in general in this society. In the Ontario context, we're talking about social assistance, and we're talking about what is now humorously referred to as employment insurance. So those systems of income support emerged in a very definite historical context. After, to go back and use England as the classic example of the emergence of a capitalist system, after the peasantry was driven from the land and a modern working class was being created, they also at the same time created a section of people who Marx would later characterize as the reserve army. Groups of people who were destitute, who had no access to employment, who had no income, and who were completely desperate. And at first, they tried to control that population through sheer state violence and terror. But they then realized that they were going to have to provide some level of support for people, because the level of dislocation and the level of social unrest was becoming unmanageable. And so they brought in the poor law system. And the whole idea of the poor laws, refined in 1834 in the new poor laws, was that it would be calculatedly as inadequate as it possibly could be, and that it would also be given under conditions that were calculatedly as degrading and unpleasant as they possibly could be, so as to ensure that people, that enough would be provided that social unrest and dislocation would be staved off, but at the same time, what was provided would not be sufficient to ensure that people had a form of income support that would give them any particular bargaining power with employers. It would not impede the flow of low-wage workers. Now, the English Poor Law Reform Commission titled this idea less eligibility. And I would argue that less eligibility has been really quite a fundamental aspect of income support systems ever since. You've ever dealt with the welfare office, it's like they give you so little and they seem to make it as unpleasant as they possibly can. And that, I think, is the legacy of the poor laws. Now, the point about this is that during the neoliberal years that we've gone through, that process has been dramatically intensified. They have sought to degrade income support systems as much as they can to ensure that people were driven into the mushrooming, low-wage, precarious work sector. And they were very, very successful in doing that. And that agenda unfolding over decades is still very much on the table. It's still very much part of the society in which we live. So the first thing that needs to be said, I think, about a system of basic income is that there's an almost magical belief that there is some quality about it that will ensure that if it emerges, it will provide a universal or widely distributed adequate payment. Whenever you debate with people on the question, there's a sort of a basic there's a basic assumption that that's the case. The former Greek Syriza finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, for example, I saw him give a talk in which he suggested that that income support systems that read the distributed income between members of the working class was no longer possible because of the driving down of wages, and income support systems that provided adequate income by a levy on the capitalist class was no longer possible because of the viciousness of the neoliberal period. Therefore, he said, we're going to introduce basic income in order to civilize capitalism. But the question is sort of raised is, if the capitalists don't want to give adequate income in the form of unemployment insurance or welfare, what is it about this basic income thing that means that it's going to be adequate? What quality is about it that exists that will make it necessarily adequate? Some will argue it's universality, but I must say universal programs have not been protected from the austerity agenda generally. Look at healthcare. So I think that's the first point that needs to be made, is that if a system of basic income were introduced, it's going to be subject to the same austerity constraints to render it as inadequate as it possibly can be. And there's no magic way around that. People say, well, look at SERB, look at what was introduced during the lockdown period. But I don't think you can say, not that I'm saying that SERB was magnificent, but the improved level of support that was given, I think reflected a particular situation of the capitalist state having to step in and prevent absolute dislocation and destitution in a situation of sudden, massive, unprecedented downturn caused by a public health disaster. But Trudeau himself, actually, at a symposium put on by the Financial Times of London, made very clear that that was not some new benchmark, that was a very temporary measure. So again, I say that basic income would be subject to the same kinds of constraints and the same kind of limitations, notwithstanding hopes and wishes for to the contrary. But I think the real problem with basic income is not just that it's an illusion in terms of the notion that it represents an end run around the realities of neoliberal austerity, and it fails to do that, in my opinion. But the other thing about basic income that I think is so dangerous, and this is why the people on the right are so enamored, many of them, there's divisions on the right as there are on the left, but so many on the right are enamored with the idea, is that it represents an intense commodification of social provision. And it does so at the worst possible time. The outrageous, racist, right-wing US political scientist Charles Murray is an enthusiastic advocate of basic income. And he makes clear that a basic income system that is provided must first of all be provided at levels that does not impede the flow of low-wage workers, but also that it must not augment existing systems of social provision. It must replace them, and that, I think, is the really dangerous thing, particularly in this context of the present period and the present austerity agenda. Basic income provides essentially, the concept provides essentially a wage subsidy to employers, particularly in the low wage sector. The pilot project that was established under the Liberals in Ontario, 70% of the people who were chosen to go on that program were people who were not on social assistance, but were from a waged background. And so they were looking to test a system, the impact of a system, to the extent that small scale tests prove anything at all. They were looking at the effects it would have on people by providing a wage subsidy. And the concept of providing a wage subsidy is, I think, a very, very dangerous one. It creates a situation where employers are now getting a portion of their wage bill covered out of the tax revenues, which is to say other workers who receive somewhat better wages are subsidizing those wages. And what that then means, of course, is that the pressure on the employers to increase levels of to increase low wages, and pressures on government to raise minimum wages are substantially undercut because you now have this subsidy carefully pegged at levels that will not provide people with increased bargaining power. And at the same time, in a context of austerity and privatization, such as we're living in the present period, I think we put ourselves in the very dangerous situation of buying into a system that will be used to further that agenda of austerity and privatization. What you arrive at is a situation where you are literally shopping through the privatized rubble of the social infrastructure with your basic income payment. You receive your payment, and then you need medication. The neoliberal marketplace is where you go buy it. You need healthcare, you need public transportation, you need post-secondary education. All these things are basic income furthers the agenda of degrading and privatizing these systems. And so I think on that basis that it represents for the left a big miscalculation. The Basic Income Canada network has calculated, and they are of course advocates of basic income, but they're looking, they float a cost for basic income of between 134 and 187 billion dollars. There's disputes about levels and all the rest of it, but we're talking about a huge expenditure. And I would certainly argue that we should not put our efforts into pressing for that extension of the cash payment, that codification. I think we could do much better if we fight for the things that people need, like an expanded healthcare system with pharmacare and denticare included, expanded free childcare, free accessible public transport. Put our fight into those things, and at the same time emphasize on the struggle to increase the rate of unionization, fight for decent wages, fight for workers' rights rather than look for what is essentially an employer's subsidy. I think that's pretty well what I need to say in terms of introducing the concept, or introducing my opposition to the concept. But I think I'd also like to suggest this, is that, and I don't mean in any way to be insulting here, and I don't mean to be in any way belittle people, but I think we have gone through a period in which the struggles that we take up we've been fighting a defensive battle for a long time. We've not been gaining ground. In fact, we've been losing ground. We've fought against social cutbacks, and we may have alleviated the damage to some degree and to some extent, but we haven't stopped it from happening. The weakening of trade unions, the undermining of the social infrastructure has been very, very enormous. And I do believe that what has emerged is a kind of a wishful thinking, a belief that there is some kind of social policy end run around the problem that can make it go away. So I do think left buy-in into basic income is significantly a manifestation of demoralization and a product of defeat. I think we can, if we are looking to put forward demands and struggles that will take us forward, I think we look to massively expand public services. We look to take up trade union and struggles for workers' rights, and they're going to be far more important in terms of immediate gains. But basic income as a system tries to, in some cases, is presented as a very radical alternative. I believe actually it makes its peace with the neoliberal reality. It accepts that employers are going to pay shitty wages. It accepts that there is huge devastation to the social infrastructure, and that the robot future is coming and all these things, and that what we need is to simply uh, get to belief. And I think it's something that we on the left, and I think socialists, should reject. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, John. Now I am pleased to welcome discussant Karen Hannon. She is a worker by day and an artist by night. She's also a member of Socialist Action residing in Toronto. Welcome, Karen.
Hi, thanks for inviting me to this discussion, and thanks, John, for that wonderful account of UBI. I look forward to hearing questions from our audience. So I began looking into UBI when I was laid off from my job and receiving the Canada Emergency Response Benefit in spring 2020. So while CERB was not equal to the wages I received working, my partner's income was unaffected by the lockdown, providing a safety net that many are not afforded. Despite its flaws, CERB gave me a taste of UBI, and now I've entered the subsequent rabbit hole of figuring out how UBI fits into our strange new world. And the more I read, the further I seem from the answer. UBI is ideally considered an unconditional amount of no strings attached money that would cover everyone's basic needs regardless of employment status. We can all agree that everyone deserves to live in dignity, and without adequate income, that is not possible. The poverty line in Canada is based on the market basket measure, where poverty is determined by whether a family has enough income to purchase specific goods and services in their community. According to the most recent published income survey by Stats Canada with data from 2018, 3.2 million, or 8.7% of Canadians lived below the poverty line. 12.3% of Canadians reported relative low income, meaning they make below 50% of the median income after taxes. Deep income poverty, or people whose income was below 75% of the poverty line, was at 4.6%. The poverty rate for children in 2018 was at 8.2%, and poverty affects children in single-parent households at a greater rate than those with two parents. So poverty was experienced by 5.8% of children in families with two parents, and 26.2% of children with single mothers experienced poverty. In 2018, 2.5% of seniors over 65 were living in poverty. So much has quite obviously changed since 2018. I couldn't seem to find any real statistics of what poverty rates look like almost 12 months into the global pandemic. However, in Toronto, there is an unemployment rate of 10.8% as of December, over double the same time in the previous year. While CERB, and now the Canada Recovery Benefit, includes certain people not otherwise covered by EI, there are many gaps in eligibility. Additionally, during a pandemic, nonetheless, federal and provincial laws do not provide paid sick leave to workers, and lower wages coincide with lack of paid sick leave. Unless workers contract or are exposed to COVID, they are not eligible for the Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit. I consider paid sick leave a basic need for all workers. When we talk about basic needs, that's a list of things: a home, food, utilities, medication, healthcare, childcare, transport, education, and so on. These things are not equal for all people in all areas or for all demographics. So how will UBI be determined? Will UBI happen alongside the improvement of other social services that provide basic needs, such as free and effective public transit, free education, increased healthcare services, affordable childcare, or controlled housing costs? After all, Canada has declared housing a human right, but has done little to follow through on that declaration, an issue further amplified by the pandemic. The list here goes on. In a time where we have austerity measures and increasing privatization that greatly impacts access to basic services, it is difficult to imagine the government justifying quote-unquote free money being given to everyone under the capitalist system. Can we realistically foresee that the implementation of UBI will not result in further cuts to healthcare, education, or public transit and other existing social services and supports? The goal of UBI should be, after all, to supplement and improve existing programs to ensure everyone lives in dignity. In August 2020, NDP MP Leah Gazan put forward a private member's motion, M46 Guaranteed Livable Basic Income. This guaranteed income would be paid regularly to all Canadians over 18, accounting for regional living costs, and would not require any participation in work or education. It would be in addition to current and future government public services and income supports. So the optimist in me is on board, and the pessimist in me says there's no way it will even be considered. And the realist, I think we need a whole system overhaul for UBI to first be adopted and then be effective. Digging deeper into statistics, in 2018, female employees aged 25 to 54 earned 13.3% less per hour on average than male counterparts, despite the fact that women have surpassed men in attaining education. In 2015, women in Canada spent an average of 1.5 more hours daily on unpaid domestic work than men. Women spent more time caring for children. Women are overrepresented in other unpaid caregiving work, such as caring for an elderly parent or family member with a disability. These unpaid occupations account in part for the overrepresentation of women in part-time or precarious work. So let's consider this quote from Stats Canada's gender-based statistical report. Two types of work are fundamental to capitalist societies: paid employment associated with the waged economy and unpaid domestic labor that produces and sustains both the current generation of workers and the children who are the future workforce. Raising children is physical and mental labor. As I look to begin a family of my own, it is stressful just considering the implications. Maternity benefits for 55 weeks of leave pays 55% of your income up to a max of $595 per week. The option to extend this to 84 weeks is paid at 33%. Then the childcare costs that follow. Some basic math tells me that having children is for the wealthy. Could UBI be the solution to the wage disparity? And will UBI make the current unpaid domestic labor of bringing up the next generation equitable, valuable, and ultimately recognized for its great importance in the continuation of humanity and society? Will UBI bring equality and dignity so people don't have to worry about whether they'll make ends meet? I thought this endeavor to talk about UBI was going to be easy, yet I haven't even touched on the real impacts of underemployment and poverty, or the significant lack of adequate supports in the current system, especially for racialized and marginalized groups, foreign workers, refugees, for people with disabilities, LGBTQ2+ communities, for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I am not an economist, a sociologist, or historian, so I feel underqualified to provide a fully informed review of UBI, which of course was not asked of me. Regardless, these are my final thoughts. Generally speaking, I don't know if UBI can work under a capitalist system. UBI may, for example, as John brought up, become a wage subsidy for employers, much like how CERB acted as a subsidy for landlords. UBI could increase austerity and privatization, justified by the need to fund the program. However, I strongly believe that those in poverty do not squander the money they receive. People in poverty lack money, not intelligence. If you give people free money, there's ample evidence that this results, at least on an individual level, there's ample evidence that the results on an individual level will be positive. In the past, I have been dismissive of UBI, but we cannot promote change when we dismiss ideas that have the potential to create positive outcomes that fundamentally do align with socialist goals. What are the steps to get us there, and what are our demands? The world is not as we want it, but a more qualified individual than myself may provide us with the roadmap that gets us to the point where a just universal basic income is possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Okay, our next discussant is Gary Porter. Gary joined the League for Socialist Action at age 19 and was active in the movement of Black freedom against the war in Vietnam, and for women and gay liberation. He was a member of Canadian Union of Public Employees, CUPE, Local 79 in Toronto. As a certified accountant and chartered accountant, Gary served on the executive of both the Ontario and Canada top CA bodies. He was a union appointee to the board of the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan and chair of the investment committee that managed its $105 billion funds. He is now a British Columbia organizer and a member of the Central Committee of Socialist Action. Welcome, Gary. I think you might be muted, Gary.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. First of all, let me apologize for being a chartered accountant. Not many of them on the side of the workers, but I tried to be. So, yes, there's been a real discussion in the past decade or so of basic income, basic guaranteed income, both in Canada and internationally, especially in the context of the current massive unemployment, small business collapses, evictions, and other economic tragedies that have risen recently as a result of the capitalist plague that we know as COVID-19. In Canada, many have received the $2,000 monthly CERB payments. $2,000, by the way, meets one of the definitions of poverty, the low-income cutoff definition, which is half the median payment, half the median wage, which Karen spoke about, and that's a definition of the poverty line. So that actually is $24,000 a year, which is roughly a poverty line definition. So what we were being given was just to keep us at the poverty line. And of course, as Trudeau said in London, don't take that for granted. That's not going to happen for long. Basic income has its supporters and detractors in both the left and the right. Free market and libertarian ideologues like Milton Friedman and Charles Murray see the possibility of eliminating publicly funded entitlements. I love that word, entitlements. It's like a house is a privilege, food is a privilege. Anyway, eliminating those in favor of impoverished members of the working class having to purchase these services in the marketplace. In fact, the core of neoliberalism, what that really means is everything is commodified. Everything operates in the capitalist market, which they describe as a free marketplace, which it isn't. It's been having been on the teachers' pension fund and having $105 billion to play with. I can tell you the big institutional investors and the massive billionaires, they control that market. And they so making it subject to their will and their whims is really what they're talking about. I know the Teachers Fund was asked by the Toronto Stock Exchange not to trade more than 100 million a day, or else we would start affecting the market. And so we moved a lot more into other markets. But anyway, on the other hand, many conservatives fear a disincentive to work. I was discussing this over coffee with a friend of mine this morning, and I said, speaking on universal basic income, and he said, wouldn't that remove the incentive to work? And I said, well, nobody's talking about it at that level. Unless you're happy to live at poverty, universal basic income is not the answer. Positions on the left also vary. Basic income has been promoted as a solution to precarious work in a gig economy. I'm going to suggest a couple of other solutions later, as a way of liberating impoverished people from an oppressive welfare bureaucracy and as a panacea for the workless world that some predict will result from automation and roboticization. Such a world would be the reward of should be, in fact, the reward of the working class, not unemployment and the obscene enrichment of billionaire parasites. And I mean that word advisedly. Billionaires are not necessary to the working class, but the working class is necessary to the billionaires. They really are parasites. But there are many who believe basic income in the current capitalist context is illusory. Some on the left propose a progressive version of basic income that would provide a great advance over existing benefits. No one wants to defend the current system of social assistance with its paternalistic bureaucracy and grossly inadequate level of support. A socialist society would guarantee decent social provision for all. The question of what form this would take remains hypothetical at this stage. But we do know that we would have all of the resources of society available to a socialist society, and not the huge amount that is held by a very, very tiny number of private hands under capitalism. Those advocating a progressive version of basic income are acting with genuine concern for the impoverished and frustration with the injustices of the current social welfare system. But in the harsh world of actually existing capitalism, basic income schemes offer the illusion of improvement in the lot of marginalized people while streamlining the existing social welfare system so as to diminish state responsibility for the welfare of its population and push this into individuals purchasing their needs in the private market. Absent a socialist transformation, basic income schemes will reflect the priorities of capitalist governments. They are in charge. The people in charge in a capitalist society are the people that own the means of production. The political parties that they buy, the Liberals and Tories, are their servants. So they run it's their state and they run it. They will be grafted onto an austerity and privatization agenda. The aim is to move impoverished into low-wage, precarious employment, provide a wage top-up to ruthless employers such as Walmart and Amazon and many others, and give governments an exit route for services that they currently provide. Ontario's former Liberal Premier Kathleen Wynne saw basic income as a way of reducing government expenditures in housing, healthcare, and other supports for the poor. Finland's center right-wing government announced it was judge its basic income experiment on whether it could move chronically unemployed into taking low-wage jobs at practically slave labor wages. That was how they would judge the success of the program. Labor has been on the defensive for almost 50 years. The relationship of class forces does not favor significant democratic or egalitarian policies orchestrated from above. Labor's traditional approach has been to fight for full employment at union rates, for a significant rise in the minimum wage, for adequate social assistance and unemployment benefits, for social entitlements that apply to the whole working class, including impoverished and marginalized people. The labor movement has recognized in the past, and seems for the most part continues to do so, the danger of means-tested programs that break with the principle of universality. It is naive to think that basic income can circumvent the capitalist labor market or transform the use of leisure time. The real transitional demand here is the reduction of the work week with no loss in pay and sharing the work. With the export of jobs and the automation, there's been a tremendous loss in the number of jobs. Now, what it is a loss of good-paying union industrial jobs. The unemployment rate, although understated, hasn't really increased that much over many decades. So there's a lot of jobs still, and but what are they? They are MIC jobs and Amazon jobs. So what we need is as unemployment rises, the work week should fall. That's really how it should be. It should be an index that unemployment causes reduction in work hours and spreads the work out, so that all of the population is working, but working less. Everybody benefits from automation. Everybody works less. Instead of the capitalists getting the profit and living a life of untold luxury. Within that framework, massive retraining and expansion of unionized employment in green and socially useful occupations is the route to go. Some sort of income guarantee would be integral in a socialist society, but this would not be the principal mechanism for social provision. Cuba gives us a glimpse. Both basic needs such as housing, transport, healthcare, and education are provided out of central state revenue and are free for every Cuban at the point of use, or some cases as a subsidy. There's a big difference between social programs as universal entitlements provided out of a collective pool of resources, a complete collective pool that includes the wealth of the former rich, and services obtained by individuals from private providers in a market that is dominated by the big capitalists. Both may exist, but any aspiring socialist society would and must try to limit the commodification of basic services in the private capitalist market. So I very much agree with John's point of view that the growing jobs, the warehousing jobs, the delivery jobs, the Uber jobs, the Lyft jobs, the Walmart jobs, and all those increasing number of very low wage jobs, what the owners of those, the multi-billionaires, are trying to do when they promote basic income is to get, as John said, well-paid workers to subsidize those who aren't, so they can maintain their very high rate of profit. And I think the workers should refuse to subsidize other workers, and they should help to organize them. And see, the problem is that right now the union leadership is not organizing.
30 seconds.
Okay, not organizing the unorganized, not leading workers in mass struggles against the bosses. That's what really needs to happen, so that the confrontation takes place on the shop floor at the point where the workers have real power, where they can stop production, stop the profit source, and then they can bargain from a point of strength against the ruling class. So that's my position: is you can't get around class struggle with a universal basic income. Class struggle is what will bring socialism.
Okay, thank you, Gary. Okay, folks, now we're going to go with the help of our technical producer, Kurt Young, and get questions from our listening audience. Kurt will he will read the questions as well, but he'll also type them in the chat column. And we will give each panelist up to 5 minutes to answer these questions. They can answer 1, 2, or 3, because there'll be 3 questions up. And the lineup will be Karen, Gary, and John. So you have up to 5 minutes each. Kurt, the questions, please.
Okay, John, I'll read them slow enough if you want to make notes about it. So
Thank you.
the first question comes from Ellen Ramsey. She asks, will basic income drive down wages and harm unions? Acacia asks, maybe a quick request for a definition of what we mean by basic income, which you may have already answered, but if you want to go over again. And Barry Weisler asks, what are some of the existing social benefits that might disappear or be privatized in the event that the capitalist state implemented a form of universal basic income?
Okay, so these are the questions. Karen, you have up to 5 minutes to answer whichever ones you wish.
All right, so I know that there's a lot of different definitions of what is meant by basic income, and there's several models that people have come up with. A lot of, so I mean, my definition that I had mentioned was an unconditional amount of no strings attached money that would cover everyone's basic needs, regardless of their employment status. But there are some models of pilot projects that are more means tested. So if you make below a certain amount, you get an income to like a set income based on that. But generally, the idea is to cover your needs through that. Now, I'm going to answer a bit of Ellen's question. I think under capitalism, yes, the basic income would likely drive down wages and harm unions, unless the only way I foresee it not happening is if UBI is set as at an amount that is equal to union wages, which I feel is incredibly unlikely, and would be, because that would be the only way it would give workers power. I think UBI could potentially give like part-time workers a bit more power, but again, it's more likely it's just going to end up in a subsidy, in terms of employers will think, well, I'm not going to raise your wages because you make enough to live on anyway, so why is it my responsibility to value you and your work? So and I think in terms of unions, yeah, I think it would harm unions. I'm not super knowledgeable about unions in general, but I think that it would give people less power in unions, because they, if they already get this income, then like, even if it's the model where everyone gets it universally, then you would, I guess, even union workers would get this amount. So increasing their wages may not be necessary, or like sick leave policies might be impacted because, well, you get this money anyway, and other benefits, of course, in the workplace may be gone. So I guess that's my interpretation or answer to those questions.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Okay, Gary? You're muted, I think, Gary.
Okay. A basic definition of a simple definition of basic income is impossible, because so many people with different class interests advocate what they call universal basic income, and all of them have completely different ideas of what they want from it. So Karen's definition of universal basic income has nothing to do with Milton Friedman's definition as a right-wing bourgeois economist at the University of Chicago. So but what I've seen is a fairly common number, is around $2,000 a month, or $24,000 a year, the kind of low income. As I said before, in Canada, that would be roughly the low income cutoff definition of poverty, would be paid to every adult in the country. So the question is, if you can live on that $24,000, you're living a life defined as poverty. Some people I know would take that and say, I'm not going to work anymore. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, people think that you're immoral if you don't want to work in the physical and soul-destroying capitalist charnel houses of labor. But I don't think there is anything wrong with that if you can live with it. But I think we all think that human beings deserve a lot more than that. So that's on the question of definition. On the question of what would go first, I think unemployment insurance would go first, and then you would be looking at out here in BC, for example, after years and years of no increase in welfare, John Horgan raised it to from $750, I think, to $1,000 a month. That's half of the definition of poverty, and that's an NDP government. But I think that would just disappear. There's a lot of, it's basically the support for people that are really desperately poor, and probably unemployment insurance would be the first things that would be attacked. Now, whether anything goes or comes is always a question of the relationship of class forces. If the unions are strong and they're willing to fight, then it's really the result is up in the air. It depends on their power and how much they can strangle the profit of the ruling class by strikes, occupations, and so on. And it becomes a different question. And of course, that's the way that workers will be mobilized to defend themselves, learn to defend themselves, learn their own independent class existence, and give themselves the confidence to be able to take over society and get rid of the parasites. So that's a major factor. That's the only way, for example, basic income contributes negatively to winning climate change or ending war and aggression, ending the military production and all that kind of stuff. I mean, if you're talking about the big social issues, universal basic income only solves some of the problems at the margins and helps to subsidize the wages in the factories and so on. See, the real thing is, real element that I see of universal basic income is massively rich. We're seeing income inequality that has never been seen before. And those very people will support universal basic income so that they can steal the wages of those better off, because they don't pay any taxes. They ship their profit offshore where it's untaxed. They get all of the capitalist politicians to reduce their taxes. So if there's going to be, it's going to cost money to do this, it's going to have to come from small shopkeepers and workers and farmers. And that's where it's going to come from. So they want to transfer those who are doing a little better to subsidize their phenomenal wealth. And I say we are not interested in that proposal.
Thank you, Gary. John?
Yeah, so first of all around driving down wages. Yeah, I mean, I think, if you provide, if they provide a very limited income that functions as an employer's subsidy, that is going to undercut the drive to increase wages in the low wage sector, and it certainly is going to as well undercut efforts to raise the minimum wage. It's certainly true that if they provided everybody with a truly adequate income on a universal basis, then the bargaining power of working class people would indeed be expanded. People I don't believe would want to. People would still want to work, but they're not going to work on the cheap. They would work. They would have increased bargaining power. But the whole point about that idea, Philippe Van Parijs, one of the big left advocates of basic income, called basic income the capitalist road to communism, and that was his notion. But of course, the capitalist job market rests on economic coercion. It's fundamental to it. That's why they didn't give the peasants the land back. And they need that economic coercion. And so they are not going to provide what would be in effect a limitless strike fund to the working class. It's simply not going to happen. But if basic income is introduced, the drive will be to ensure it's as inadequate as possible. On that basis, it would drive down wages. And let me just say, I think definition of basic income, the only thing that needs to be noted is that there is an idea of a universal payment that goes to everybody that's truly adequate. That does exist. But in practice, most of the proposals that are put on the table with any sort of level of seriousness are about raising everybody to a certain minimum level. And that's the sort of the idea that's really current and really up for discussion, I think. Secondly, or thirdly, with regards to what services would be cut. Well, I mean, there are immediate things that if a basic income system were introduced, other income support systems would be rolled into it. So they would go, yes. But the real question, I think, is that in this context of an austerity and privatization agenda, the argument would be put forward is that you now have your basic payment, and that's what you go and shop with. And therefore that would facilitate the attack on public services. And I mean all public services, whether we're talking about education, whether we're talking about healthcare, whether we're talking about any kind of a basic public service. It further the commodification of the process and strengthen that neoliberal expansion of the marketplace.
Okay, thank you, John. So now we're going to go back to our producer, Kurt, for 3 more questions. And the panelists will have up to 5 minutes each again. And the lineup will be Gary, John, and Karen. Kurt?
Okay, so our first question comes from Andrew. He asks, if basic income creates economic growth, isn't there more tax revenue overall? So at some point, the social benefits initially cut for basic income can be reinstated. Edutainment asks, what would you say could work for those people who can't find reliable work, whether because of job scarcity, skill deficit, disability, etc.? And Betty Jane Antanavicius asks, wouldn't it redefine work?
Okay, back to our panelists, 5 minutes each. Gary.
Okay, well, first of all, on the last one, would it redefine work? Not under capitalism. Under various programs, the recipients of universal basic income would have either more or less, if they have any, it may give them a little flexibility, it may give them more flexibility, but we know that the people who rule this society, and let's not forget about who rules this society, are going to make it a marginal existence, an existence that can be done without affecting their rate of profit. So I think actually what it's designed to do is drive down the quality of work, so that as I say, the more well-off workers subsidize the less well-off workers, and everybody ends up with less. You may get a little more on the absolute lowest scale. We're subsidizing the billionaire, the real bad billionaires like Jeff Bezos and the Walmarts and so on. The only other factor you have to take into account, which we haven't mentioned today, is that maybe a scarcity of certain kinds of labor can force up the price of labor, and that's just another element of the market. But in general, I think the pressure will be for wages to go down under a form of universal basic income. Because when you add the two together, whatever your wages are plus universal basic income, there's still only a certain amount that can go to the working class if the level of profit is going to stay the same. And don't think that the rulers are not aware of that. So it's just a question of how you distribute it among the working class. And universal basic income, as I say and have repeated before, is distributing mostly among the working class, not anything from the rich. We want to take the money from the rich. So we want to create a socialist society, which means we need an independent, mobilized workforce. We need a strong union movement and a politicized union working class. And that it develops in struggle. So, that's one of the things that the universal basic income is designed to do is remove the conflict of the class, of the two classes at the point of production, and try to move it off into other broader areas where there's less power of the workers, because it doesn't affect the fact that the workers can stop production, occupy factories, and start really making the ruling class pay. So I don't like that reorientation away from the point where workers actually have power. Okay, now, universal basic income is not really the question that was asked about those who can't find reliable work, job scarcity. We have all kinds of programs now, very much inadequate, often very paternalistically allocated and so on. But we have programs that actually meet every one of those points now. If the unions were really fighting as social forces, they would be fighting for increasing those payments rather than and fighting the bosses for higher wages. I'm not. Anyway, that's all I have to say on that. I guess that's so. I started with redefining work, and I think work would be redefined as more bad low-paid jobs. I think that's what it's meant to subsidize.
Okay,
I'm done.
thank you. Okay, thank you, Gary. John?
Yes, I think I'm going to focus on the second question, which I think is a very important one, and that is the question of what about people who are presently outside of the job market by reason of fluctuations in unemployment levels, but also those people who may be outside because they have been socially constructed as disabled in this society. Those are very the systems that exist to provide income support for people are unquestionably grossly inadequate and punitive. And most of what I've done over the years has actually been about challenging those systems. So I don't, what I said about not wanting to expand the commodification of social provision, by that I don't mean that existing systems shouldn't be challenged. Gary's point is completely correct in my view, that if we had a trade union movement that was in the state it should be, it would recognize it was in the vital interests of all working class people to ensure that income support systems were adequate, and not just that they provided adequate amounts of money, but that they were accessible to people, and that they weren't dominated by punitive and intrusive rules and moral policing and all the things that happen at the moment. And that's a very, very important part of the struggle that we have to take up in the period ahead. I'm certainly not saying that, there's these people living on social assistance systems and that's just the way it is and it's unfortunate, there's nothing we can do about that. It's a very, very important struggle, and it's a very, very vital working class struggle. As in, we have to build a movement that fights to defend its gains, but it doesn't leave anybody behind. And at the moment, people on income support systems are being left behind, whether they're injured workers, whether they're disabled people, whether they're unemployed. That's happening on an enormous scale. It's shameful, and it's a shame on our movements as well that more isn't being done to challenge that. But I do have to say, and I come back to my basic point, that basic income doesn't just offer a way to get around that. It isn't that, everybody's living on these grossly inadequate systems and there's this basic income just ready to be kicked in that's going to start providing adequately for people. I question that. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think they're going to, there's no immediate likelihood of a basic income system, but if it were introduced, it would be subject to exactly the same processes and constraints. It would face the same austerity agenda. They would want to ensure that it was inadequate as it possibly could be. And the adequacy of any income support system reflects the balance of forces in society. It reflects how strong the working class is, how united the working class is, and as part of our struggle, we must fight for decent and adequate, accessible income support systems given to people as a matter of right.
Okay, thank you, John. Karen?
Hi again. I think I'm on. So I think that a few things about work for people who can't find reliable work, or like I discussed about unpaid care work. I think there are significant things that need to be looked at to make those people like have it easier for people to access funds and have more adequate funding. Like EI is not adequate. Like Gary's mentioned, those numbers, if CERB is below or is at the poverty line, then EI is for a lot of people below that as well, as it's capped. And there's money out there to pay for increased services for people. And I think that, we need to be taxing the rich. And some people talk about a wealth cap, and like, that sounds great, but I just don't imagine that happening, because that would disincentivize profit, and then that makes capitalism not as important, and it just wouldn't happen under the system. So I just don't know. I don't know enough about existing social services, and I just know it's very hard to access for many people. But I think that we need to be fighting for an increased accessibility for those people, increased funding, taxing the rich to fund those services. But I don't really have a real answer. Andrew asked about the economic growth of that will come with UBI, and it is true that people who have especially people who don't have money and then they have money, they're going to spend it, and that goes back into the economy, as it were. But I don't think that's I don't think that in terms of like socialism, I don't think that's really our goal. We want people to have a good life, but I don't know if concerns with the profits for billionaires and that economic growth is really, from my perspective, that's not like what we should be basing or accepting it for those reasons. Because again, if we're just subsidizing the bosses so that they can have more profit, just not good. I think we should be pushing for worker-owned businesses. I think that we shouldn't be working for people, but with people. Yeah, and then redefining work. I think in some ways it would redefine work. I think UBI would bring opportunity for people to choose not to go into precarious work, but still living, unless UBI is set at like a adequate and high enough place, it still isn't going to get people out of poverty, generally speaking. So those are my thoughts.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Okay, so we're going to go back again to our producer and I think we're going to take 4 questions this time, but you will still only have 5 minutes each to answer. And the lineup will be John, Karen, and Gary. Kurt?
Okay, so our first questions comes from Rosemary Hinatiuk, who asks, why would we automatically assume that all things related to the social safety net would necessarily fall away and force everyone to seek out these services in the marketplace? The Real Butter Dave asks, couldn't UBI act the same time as Universal Strike Fund, strengthening unions by providing bottomless strike pay? Andrew asks, how is basic income a wage subsidy? I was of the opinion that it would operate in the opposite way and that employers would have to present better deals for workers because it isn't necessary to work for a living. And Barry Weisletter asks, if a market solution like basic income is illusory, then the viable alternative is a democratically planned economy which only a workers' government could deliver. Is revolution the solution?
Okay, John, you can take on all 4 or whichever you please. You have up to 5 minutes.
All right. So why would other services be degraded? I think was the question. Because I think we're in the midst of an agenda where that is precisely what's happening. And so those in power and those who have the ear of those in power, I think, are going to be using the cash payment that people get, the universal or widely distributed cash payment, as a replacement for existing services. It would fall in line with the prevailing agenda that's being imposed on us. Could it function as a universal strike fund? Well, I mean, it could, in the sense that, I mean, I could go to a drawing board and design a completely adequate payment that everybody's going to get, and when everybody received it, yes, they have enormously increased bargaining power. But assessing the capitalist system and assessing the balance of forces that exists in society now, the question I would pose is, how likely is that to happen? How likely are we going to be to achieve a situation where the capitalist state provides the working class with a strike fund? I don't think that's particularly likely. And if we're strong enough to impose that, I think we should just move to Barry's solution anyway and go for revolution, because if we can make them give up the economic coercion on which their system stands, then I don't really think we need to be worrying about social policy at all. And would it be a wage subsidy? Yes, in my opinion, it would be. It would be a wage subsidy, again, unless it was provided in a truly universal, adequate fashion, which I don't think is likely. But the question of socialism and the question of social transformation really does, I think, become a vital part of the discussion, in the sense that, yes, we fight for definite things under this system at every point. Improve public services, we fight for better income support systems, we fight for all those things. But I think as socialists, we also take the position that we are not going to win. We are not going to win a just and a fair arrangement under this system. We have to move towards a better system. We have to look at challenging capitalism itself. And at its most delusional, basic income is presented as a kind of a Shangri-La post-capitalist sort of a post-capitalist society with capitalism still in place, where everybody gets this adequate income. They can go to work or not go to work as they see fit. They can participate in the job market. They can go off and do other things, and it's all up to them. And that simply is not a reality under the existing system. So, I mean, the strength, when people put forward basic income ideas, generally speaking, there's a great strength on the side of how good it would be. There's a less serious appraisal of the actual practical possibilities that exist with regards to realizing it.
Oh, okay, John. Thank you. Karen?
Yeah, so also to answer Rosemary's question about why people would have to seek out services in the marketplace. I don't know if this is a good example, but with CERB this year, getting $2,000 before taxes, that money wouldn't even pay my rent if I was living alone in my apartment. And so I think in that case, it made the governments not look at like, hey, people have to pay rent. Let's look at these ridiculous prices. Let's bring them down. But instead, this privatization that exists in housing, people still have to pay for their rent. I know it's not exactly what you mean by that, but I think providing for if someone says, well, you've already got this income, why should we be subsidizing your medications because you can now pay for those? We're not going to bring in free dental care because, well, you must have workplace benefits still, so it's not important, and you have all this money. I don't see there being anything new provided to people, and like we've seen privatization in utilities across the country, and I think we would just see more of that, and probably less control of those fees. Let me see the questions. Again, like I've said before, I think that the only way that UBI would be like a strike fund is if they're paying at the same rate as the union workers would make, because most people don't really like to just I mean, yeah, people do it with striking, it's really important, but how are we going to, I guess, see see any agreements if people are well, you can be on strike and we can and you're being paid, so why would I agree to do anything more for you? I feel like that would be where it would go. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Gary?
I would like to. Where's my? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I would like to step back and talk about what's the difference between social services and private services. When I was an accountant, our firm was awarded a contract by the government of Ontario to take a look at how much fraud there was in the Ontario Health Insurance Program, OHIP. And we went down to Kingston, where the head office is, and we did we took a couple of statisticians and so on, and we did all sorts of research on the database. And we had to ask the questions. Their programmers designed how to ask the questions. They screened the data as a result to ensure privacy and that nobody's health records were revealed, and gave us the raw statistical data. And it turned out there was very, very little fraud in the Ontario Health Insurance System. In the United States, they assume and have proven over and over again that in their health system that there's about 10% what they call fraud. So what was the difference? And the difference was this: down there, see, we have a universal. We cover a lot of services that their insurance doesn't. So there's very little reason on that level to cheat. Why would you do it? It's covered. There's a single payer system, so you can't be submitting bills to two insurance companies because there's one. It's either covered or it's not, and it's either going to be paid for or it's not. But and there was a third reason that I can't think of right now, but we analyzed these. And so, the other thing was that at that time, health insurance was costing Ontario about 10% of the GDP, and in the United States, it's 15%, and that is with, at the time, 37 million people not even covered. What is the difference? The difference is that it's the free market is a frightfully inefficient place, contrary to the capitalist ideology that the market makes everything efficient. On the contrary, it creates amazing amounts of waste. Multiple different bureaucracies all doing the same thing and all being paid outrageous rates, and for the top levels, so that it demonstrated the absolute superiority, even under capitalism, of an OHIP type system over the private system in the United States. Now, that's an example of why you don't want. It's just the whole thing will deteriorate, will cost more, will provide less service, will be harder to get. Some things won't be covered. It's just a terrible business to go into commodification of services. I want to step back and say that one of the reasons for the CERB payments, and one of the reasons that the capitalists look at universal basic income, is that capitalism has to expand to survive. And with the introduction of new technology, which gives them a brief moment of higher profits, their competitors pick up the same technology, and the rate of profit starts falling again. And there's a long-term trend of the rate of profit to fall. And the demand to expand means there's got to be money in the marketplace to buy things. And one of the main reasons for CERB wasn't so much concerned about the welfare of Canadian workers as it was to keep buying, so that capitalism wouldn't suffer too much. And it's always a motive. And it's also a motive for proposing universal basic income, is to grease the wheels of the capitalist and profit-making system. They have their reasons, and we have our preference for how we want to fight. The other thing about capitalism is that any gain you make, And when the relationship of forces is right, when they have the strength and the workers are weak, they will take it back. So universal basic income, even if you won it, would never be secure. The only way to have secure income is to get rid of capitalism. And, when I ran for treasurer of the NDP at the last federal convention in Ottawa in 2018, one of the things I said in my presentation was, there's a wing of this party that just wants to reform capitalism. But the problem is it's one step forward, two steps back. Nothing is secure as long as you leave the capitalists in charge of the economy and their state in charge of administration and control, the cops, the army, and the economic controls, the poverty and so on. So you have to fight to get rid of the capitalist system. That's the only, if you're looking for
30 seconds.
security, you've got to go past capitalism. And the best way to do that is to find the ways of winning things that mobilize and educate the workers as to their own power, their fabulous, fantastic power, once they begin to realize it, and also to realize they need us, but we don't need them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gary. Okay, so we have time for our two last questions, but you will only be given 3 minutes each to answer. And the lineup will be Karen, John, and Gary. Back to Kurt for the questions.
Okay, so these are actually two short questions from the same speaker. Betty Jane Antonovicius asked both these questions. She asked, could you define rentier capitalism? As well, she asked, wouldn't UBI reduce bureaucracy?
Okay, so we're going back to the panel to answer if they so wish. Karen, John, and Gary. You have 3 minutes. Karen?
So
can I cut in for 1 second?
Yes, of course.
People faded out. I didn't hear the questions.
Okay, I asked,
quickly repeat them.
Could you define rentier capitalism, and wouldn't UBI reduce bureaucracy?
Okay.
Can I suggest you spell? Can I suggest the producer spell rentier?
RENTIER.
Okay.
Okay, all right, Karen, 3 minutes.
I feel like I can't really answer these questions, but I did notice in the comments on the webcast that Mark Kasatsky mentioned that there was a pilot project in Manitoba, and that was in Dauphin, Manitoba, in the 70s. And I think it is an interesting thing that information was only actually gone through more recently, because it was in boxes for many, many years. But yeah, Mark, that is a thing. And it is worth looking at. It is an interesting pilot project. That's all I have to say.
That's fine, Karen. Thank you. John?
Well, I mean, one of the things about basic income is that, and this objection has been raised by some people, is that if a money were given, Gary raised it with regards to CERB, if there was a sudden significant increase in the amount of money that everybody had under the existing system, it would basically function as a subsidy for landlords and retail companies and whatever else. They would grab it through increased rents, increased prices, and without a kind of a strict control of that, which is very unlikely under this system, that would certainly occur. However, I don't believe that kind of payment is on the cards. So a major issue. With regards to bureaucracy, the one thing the basic income promises to do, which I would agree with, is end a great deal of the bureaucratic intrusion and moral policing that exists within existing systems. That should end anyway. And I don't believe that should mean that public sector workers lose their jobs. It just means the functions that people perform need to be reorganized. But yes, systems of intrusion and intense monitoring and all the rest of it that exists need to go one way or the other. And just let me finally very quickly say with regards to pilot projects is that no one disputes if you take a couple of thousand very poor people and give them a bit more money, they're going to be a bit better off. When they do these pilot projects, what they're basically doing is not testing basic income, they're testing poor people to see if they're morally worthy to take some extra money without and use it well and use it wisely. And that doesn't prove very much. To test basic income, you'd have to look at its effects on a whole major economic political jurisdiction. And that is something that has never happened.
Okay, thanks, John. Gary?
Well, I'm not sure if I'm defining rentier capitalism, but I know that one way that I've heard it used is that there's not a lot of the let me start with Reagan. Reagan came forward with the concept of trickle-down economics. If you cut tax rates, then those taxes would get used by the capitalists to build industries and create good union jobs and all that kind of stuff. But it didn't happen. They didn't invest anymore because they couldn't see anywhere else to invest that would make profit. So what they did is they speculated, speculative capitalism, and offshore, moved it offshore and speculated in paper, in bonds and stocks and other things like that. What do you call them? Anyway, all sorts of speculative instruments, and did not create any more work. And then, of course, there's the standard definition of rental: the landlord of real estate or the owner of anything in which they own it, but all they do is make money by letting other people use it. And then there's the coupon clippers, the totally useless people, the sons and daughters and relatives of the rich capitalists who live off it and perform no useful service at all. So to me, that's what that is. And I think actually UBI might decrease bureaucracy, but I have a feeling that you'll never get away from this capitalist state trying to oversee us and manage the way we live, so that finding ways to tell us that what we're doing doesn't quite fit in with capitalist morality for what passes for morality. Let me go back to one other point. I am in favor of anything that reduces work. I don't think we should spend as little time working in capitalist industry as possible. But the way we do it is we do it by the workers fighting to get the benefits of automation through shorter hours. And I reiterate my earlier point that, in my opinion, if unemployment rises, hours should fall, and everybody spreads the work. And therefore, the benefit of automation, you fight so that the benefit of automation spreads to the working class, who increase the productivity, who actually built the robots and developed the automation, and the capitalists invested money that wasn't theirs in the first place. So, as I say, we don't need them; they need us. The biggest, one final word, the biggest problem about talking about the role the working class can play and how a strong militant working class can change everything is the failure of the bureaucratic right-wing pro-capitalist leadership of the labor movement is the big obstacle. As Trotsky said back in 1938, the crisis of society can be summed up in the crisis of the leadership of the working class. And that's absolutely true. That's why Socialist Action exists, even though we're small in numbers, is to teach everybody we can reach that the whole issue here is getting rid of the misleaders and developing a new leadership of the working class, showing the working class their own power, and starting the fight seriously for a change in society through a workers' government. Thank you. Thank
you, Gary. Special thanks to all of our panelists, John, Karen, and Gary, and to our producer, Kurt Young in Mississauga, and everyone who participated in tonight's conversation. If you would like to talk to us about joining SA, write to socialistactioncanada@gmail.com or just call us at 647-986-1917. That's 647-986-1917. And folks, once again, if you like this show, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. The next webcast will be, Why Can't the Left Unite. Featuring Barry Weisletter, Federal Secretary of Socialist Action Canada, and discussants Yvonne Anson from Vancouver and Emily Stairs from Guelph. That webcast will be Thursday, January 28th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. For the details, just visit www.socialistaction.ca. In the meantime, please stay safe, stay healthy, and be active. Bye for